Good evening, everyone. I'm so happy to see you all in our Zoom meeting of Israeli and Palestinian for Peace group. Today, we are happy to host our guests, Dr. Sam Bahour and Professor Bernard AVISHAI, who will discuss Israel-Palestine Confederation. I would like to thank Mark Shatton for arranging this meeting. Ahlan wa sahlan, all of you. We would like to start with Professor Bernard Avishai to give us a background and explain his idea. Thank you. تفضل.
Okay. I just want to make some very preliminary points about the Confederation design, the idea of Confederation. But I want to first acknowledge that we are not in a situation right now which I think we can genuinely call a peace process. Quite the contrary. So I think it's important for us not to get bogged down now in this discussion about whether anything we say here is quote unquote realistic, because until we have two sides actually willing to engage in a peace process leading to a reciprocal dignity of two nations, we are not really in a situation where we can talk about taking steps that are quote unquote realistic. But I think we can talk about an idea of justice. What does a just solution look like, so that we at least know what to hope for and what to work toward? And I think Sam and I have always thought about Confederation in that spirit, in that context. The second thing I'd like to say right off the bat is that Sam and I are not offering Confederation as an alternative to a two-state solution. We see Confederation as the culmination of a two-state solution. We think that it was always irrational and ignorant to think about two states living in such close proximity without having confederal relations in the first place. And when you, Sam pointed this out, if you go back to the original partition plan, it was understood that it would be a confederation. If you look at all the peace talks that have led in some productive way to shared ideas, confederal ideas always come up. I also want to be clear that all we mean by confederation is that you have two independent entities, two independent sovereign negotiating partners who are trying to come to areas of reciprocal cooperation where reciprocal cooperation is necessary, and where they're independent, where they can be, but interdependent where they must be. And if you think about it that way, there's a very wide array of areas in which confederation is necessary. After all, we're talking about two entities, two potential, if we do ever get to statehood for Palestine, we're still going to be in an area north of Beersheba to the Lebanese border where Israel and Palestine together are about the size of greater Los Angeles. So we're in such close proximity that we have to think about all the shared jurisdictions that are going to be necessary to make two states work. Water, sewage, healthcare, all kinds of things. Bandwidth. The other thing I want to say is, if often when you hear about confederation, it's in the context of finding a solution for the settlements on the one hand and the refugees on the other. You know, because you have confederation, you can have forms of residency that allow Palestinians to live in Israel as permanent residents, but not as citizens, Israelis living in Palestine as permanent residents, not as citizens. It's often raised in that context. And my point would be that even if there wasn't a single refugee, and even if there wasn't a single settler, you would still need to have confederation between Israel and Palestine. You would always have had to have confederation between Israel and Palestine to handle all the jurisdictions that need to be shared. And you'd have to do it in order to create a collective security environment so that people who are against peace and prefer a fight to the finish have a common collective security regime that they're attacking, and not working to polarize the situation by attacking the other side. And the other side then says to this side, you handle it or else we will. If you have that kind of environment, then you have what happened in Oslo during the Oslo process, where people who were against reconciliation managed to polarize the situation and bring both sides apart. And finally, I want to make the point that often when—
I'm sorry, Bernard, are you open to questions or you want to finish?
No, I'm just about to finish. And I think Sam may want something will have something to say as well.
I had a question, a clarification about what you just said.
I'll come back to it in a second. The final point I would make is often when people challenge the question of confederation, they say, well, where else in the world has anything like this ever worked? And we can point to the European Union, Belgium, Canada. There are all kinds of places where it might be pointed. We may point to it. But I would make another simple point, which, given the conditions of Israel and Palestine, if there were not another place in the whole world where confederation ever worked, it would have to be invented for this one case, precisely because of everything else I've been talking about. And with that, I'll close for now.
Maybe it's best, Bernie, since you're under a time constraint, that people ask you questions based on what you said. That way you can be free to walk out if you need to, and I can do my part after the questions, if that works for everybody.
You know, my suggestion would be I think it'd be good for Sam for you to give your overview, just so both overviews are at least provided. That's my recommendation.
As you wish. Maury? Okay.
Yeah, let's go with that. Yeah.
Okay, I actually have a presentation that I'll put on the screen. It is my interpretation of how I see Confederation. It is not Bernie and my opinion, even though I think it reflects a lot of what we think together. Let me just bring it up here. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we see.
Okay. Okay, very briefly, there's only bullet points here, but I want to go through my understanding, just so this group knows, but just to make sure that we understand the context that we're talking about, a tiny piece of land. And that's significant because all of the effort over the last 75 years, all the money over the last 30 years is not able to resolve something which is as big as Queens, New York. And I think that says a lot about the political will behind all of those efforts. My narrative starts with, there was a Palestine before 1948. And a lot of times we forget, and the 1948 has been ingrained in our minds. But I actually respect this website that I got this map from, which is Palestine Remembered, where you can go into any of the districts and learn a little bit about what this place was before the state of Israel was created. I think that's a good contextual starting point. In Resolution 181 of the General Assembly in 1947 is the first time that a two-state solution, quote unquote, was partition plan was placed on the UN table. It is a very detailed document. However, it talks about two states, one Jewish and one Arab, without that detailed document defining what Jewish or Arab means. Arab could mean Saudi Arabians for all that we know. So I personally dismiss both of those words, given they're not defined in that resolution, and I look at the partition as two states. This is the original map of that two states as detailed in the resolution. A result of the 1948 war and Israel's military occupation of 1967, we're left with two entities. One is what is recognized in the world as the State of Israel, and I should note, Palestinians today recognize that as well as a state, and the occupied Palestinian territory, the gray part of the map. If we go forward, especially during the last 30 years of negotiating, the emerging Palestine is actually a set of Bantustans that the Palestinian population centers are being squeezed into. And this is the result of basically the US monopolizing a 25, 30-year peace process, which supposedly exists today. But as Bernie properly said, we are in no process today, definitely not a peace process. So if we look over the maps over time, one thing is very clear. Impunity comes with a cost. Impunity doesn't mean that we accept facts on the ground. It means that there's a cost, which means it's more expensive and more time-consuming and more effort to undo the damages that were done. But this is where we're heading, and it's getting worse by the day. I put an article, just a quote from an article here, not to read it, but this was the former Shin Bet, the Israeli Internal Security Service chief, who wrote in 2013, long before this current government in Israel, that Israel is nears a point of no return for two states. And he correctly says, some people have said we've already crossed that threshold. And I just put this here to put things in context, that Israeli important characters within the stakeholder community have acknowledged the track that Israel is heading on for a very long time now. So I personally have some assumptions for a way forward. Assumption number one is that international law, not a US dictated rules-based order, whatever that means, applies. International law is codified, we can read it, we can agree or disagree, but the body of law is rather accepted as a terms of references of how states and conflicts should interact. Second assumption, the Palestinian and the Israeli people are not going to disappear. It's something that I said, it's something that we say, and it's something that people like Edward Said said in his writings as well. And we need to be able to accept this, to be able to understand that we need to find a way forward, which is a collective way forward. Another assumption I have is two states, Palestine and Israel, for the most part is already a decided fact. Although they're recognized differently in the United Nations, one is a full member state, Israel, and one is a non-member observer state, Palestine. We are classified just like the Holy See today, but the state recognition is already a decided fact. It's not that I like or not like that we accept the state of Israel or I accept the state of Palestine truncated, because that's what it is. But those are the political capital that has been spent by Palestinian and Israeli leadership. So I'm accepting the responsibility of my political leadership making mistakes as well, and I think that's important. Another assumption moving forward is that the situation on the ground is deteriorating at a pace which is taking us to a full-scale new round of violence. I think it has already begun. Things are very, very tense on the ground. Bloodshed is happening daily. Another component in my thinking in terms of assumption is that the Palestinian internal affairs has entered a very dangerous phase. Not only that we're not having elections, so we can have a representative leadership, but our judiciary has been damaged. The independence of the judiciary has been damaged long before the Israeli judiciary was damaged. Our education system is going through some very hard times, as is our healthcare and economics in general. So this is an assumption of why we need to have some urgency in thinking forward. And also, I have an assumption, being an American, I watch this closely, is that the fiasco of the US administration, successive US administrations, not this administration per se, not the Trump administration per se, but over time, this monopolization by US administrations of the peace process, or the Oslo Accords process, if we can call it that, the failure of that so many times and so dramatically today opens up some windows or doors, or at least cracks them open, for lawmakers in the US and elsewhere, and civil society to create new realities, at least in our thinking in terms of moving forward. Having said that, I start with some driving convictions. My first conviction is illegality will not be accepted, in my opinion. The picture up there is the Moroccan quarter of the old city, what you know today as the bottom picture, which is the Wailing Wall Plaza. Those are illegal acts that took place at a specific time in history, and I don't personally accept them when I think about Confederation. I think of how to mitigate the damages that were done. Another conviction I have is that there is no military solution to this conflict. One side can't win, Israel, no matter how much of a military might they have become, including their nuclear power, and one side can't lose due to the steadfastness embedded in our society and the deep justice of our cause. Those two elements make me want to think how jointly we can find a model that both sides have interest in. Also, I believe that Palestinians will accept no less than an independent and sovereign state. That state will either be from the river to the sea, i.e. reconstituting the historic British mandated Palestine, or it will be what the Palestinian political agency to date has accepted, which is a truncated state of Palestine in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza Strip. And I purposely put to date in red because we are in a phase where we are seeing the old guard of the Palestinian political agency exiting the political theater, and the new generation will enter. That new generation very possibly may drop statehood and convert this to a civil rights struggle, which to me is not a solution at all. And lastly, a driving conviction is without military occupation, if we can remove that from our lexicon, there is much more in common between Israelis and Palestinians than meets the eye. And I think we should keep that in mind as we go forward. So what's Confederation? In my opinion, I accept exactly what Bernie was saying, but I'll give it a different kind of angle. To me, it's like a marriage contract. What's a marriage contract? It's two individual human beings who decide they want to merge into a family, into a house, into a household. Those two individuals may be very different. One likes chocolate, one likes oranges, and that's okay. They can still go into a marriage contract because what they have in common will be more than what separates them. If that process works out, they live happily ever after. If they don't, then the two individuals revert back to their individual status as human beings, one liking chocolate, one liking oranges. They don't kill each other if it doesn't work out. And I think that's why the starting point for what we're talking about is two independent states in order for us to have something to fall back on. But even if it works out, there are some things that by definition, the two sides want to have separated. Israel wants Hebrew as its state's language. Palestine wants Arabic. Israel may want their own legislative body to be able to oversee their religious institutions and oversee their education and oversee their healthcare. The Palestinians want to oversee their own narrative in their own schools. So each entity has its own legislative bodies to be able to deal with its internal affairs. But again, we believe that the confederal model allows them to work together on things that they have in common, like a recent example, pandemics. We need to work together. The pandemic didn't know the green line. And there's many, many other examples as well.
Sam, can I just say, I think this is an arranged marriage where sort of—
We have many of those and they work fine sometimes too. So just to recap here, international law is applied. This is to me a core feature of how parties need to be able to have a third-party reference. And the quote from the article that we wrote makes that case as well. The other point that I would like to make is, in terms of Jerusalem and borders, two very tense issues. For us, we believe, again, if the East Jerusalem is occupied territory, Palestinians have a right to create their capital in East Jerusalem. Israel already controls West Jerusalem as part of the state of Israel. once there is a model to move forward and both parties accept those two realities, because I should note, the West Jerusalem was not part of the original 181 resolution, but has been accepted in the world. We believe that just like both parties have an interest to keep Jerusalem's borders porous, open, not a wall between them, because the tourist who comes to Jordan wants to go to Petra, comes through Bethlehem, wants to go to Jerusalem, then wants to head up to Nazareth before leaving the area. And both sides have interest to allow that path to be very streamlined. And if Jerusalem can have porous borders, we can envision in the future, maybe not immediately, but in the future, that both Palestine and Israel overall can have porous borders. That's not too hard for me to imagine, because when I came here as a child, for all my childhood, that was the case. I got in the car in Ramallah and was able to drive to the sea for the weekend. No checkpoints, no walls between us. And the last big issue that we need to address, and I put this clearly, that for me, Palestinian refugees and Israeli settlers are not in the same sentence. They're not even in the same discussion. On the one side, you have a body of people called Palestinian refugees who have a right to return home. That's an Israeli responsibility to uphold that right. It should not have to be in a negotiating process. It should not have to be even within a Palestinian political agency. It's a responsibility of the state of Israel to allow people that fled during war to come home. On the other hand, different room, different discussion. We have today Israeli settlers who are illegal, regardless if they are in big settlements that Israelis classify as cities like Male Adumim, or if they're in outposts, one container on a hilltop that even in Israeli lexicon, they call it an illegal outpost. It doesn't matter what Israel calls any of those. Every single settler in the occupied territory is illegal, as their settlements are illegal. If the Palestinians desire, and it's a Palestinian decision, to allow not settlers, because in a confederal model, there are no settlers left. There are Israeli citizens who may desire to reside under Palestinian statehood. And the Palestinians will have a policy of immigration to see if people can be able, and a specific number can be able to have residency in Palestine, not in an illegal settlement. And I'm not going to go through this. This is a post I made a couple of days ago. Bernie said it in a much more concise way. We are not today in a position thinking that this is going to be applied tomorrow. We are trying to create a new language, but we understand that where we are today is a continuation of the disaster that has been going on for the last decades. And ultimately, without accountability, both sides being held accountable, without that, there is no chance for success, no matter what the framework is to move forward. And we need to be able to start holding people accountable in proportion, like international law says, to their wrongs. So for me, Confederation, in a way, calls Israel's political bluff. Not only this government, but successive governments. I don't think any Israeli government actually envisioned a Palestinian state to be allowed to be created anywhere between the river and the sea. But in the meantime, as we're having this conversation about a framework to move forward, stopping human rights abuses requires no call. We can work on that together no matter who we are today, as we consider various frameworks, Confederation or otherwise. Thank you.
Can I just make one quick point? I promise it'll be quick because I feel we're just laying everything out on the table, and we didn't actually address one thing that I think does need to be laid out on the table, and that's economic opportunity. We've been talking about all the negative things that are pushing the sides towards resolution in the context of potential confederation. But I think it's important also to recognize the tremendous opportunity cost of war. We are actually able to imagine very easily what the tremendous economic benefits would be to having this kind of confederation. A Palestinian state is going to have to rest not on agriculture and olive trees and traditional life. The cities of Palestine have to be able to generate a tremendous amount of entrepreneurial energy. And having Israel next door is a very great opportunity for cooperation, partnerships, know-how, etc. And we can talk much more about that also. But it's also true in the other direction. Israel wants to be accepted in the region, wants acceptance in the Gulf, and having Palestinian partners to go to Jordan, to go to Kuwait, to go to the Gulf, and be able to have that kind of help and partnership in bringing Israeli businesses to the Gulf is a tremendous asset, and also to Egypt, of course, which is a big untapped potential. So I feel like, you know, Sam and I can say much more about entrepreneurship and how you build entrepreneurial ventures and why reciprocity is such a potential value to both sides. But I just want to lay that on the table before we just leave the subject. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you, Bernard. Dhafer? Dhafer, first one who has a question. Maybe I said the name not good. Okay, Alzir, Dhafer Alzir. Okay. So maybe we go to Avi.
First of all, thank you very much. I really support any peaceful solution based on, as you said, on two-state solution with a confederation, without a confederation. I think confederation is probably will be something a must in years to come. And of course, whatever you said, Avishai, about economical benefits, I think it's everybody knows it in tourism, in whatever. All of us will benefit, and I'm sure that one day, today, a short time after peace will be in reality. Everybody will look at our generation as the most foolish people that thought about some kind of land and didn't see the advantage of a peaceful life. But I think I didn't hear, and I think one of the main, how to say, the explosive matter of hot potatoes is the refugees problem. And while Sam, when you said that refugees will be able to return, where are they going to be returned? Are they going to, and how many? I think one of the most frightening things of most Israelis is to see millions of refugees coming back. The Palestinian refugees issue is the only one that exists in the world 75 years after the conflict started. Nowhere in Europe, in India, Pakistan, whatever, refugees stayed as an issue for so many years. It is here, and we have to solve it. But I can't see, as an Israeli who wish to live in peace, in two-state solution, with confederation or without confederation, I don't see any logic that millions of Palestinians will come back to their homes, or not to their homes, but the new cities inside the Israelis. Why can't we build new rawabis in Ramallah, in Hebron, in Jericho, in Gaza, and wherever? Why is it so important to return to Jaffa, to Haifa, to Lod, to Ramle, after 70 years of bloody conflict? How can we mix societies again together in such intense places? You said yourself that this is such a small area, greater Los Angeles, bigger New York, greater New York, whatever.
Thank you, Avi. I think your point is clear.
We have to think about something different.
Yeah. Who wants to answer, Sam or Avishai?
I can try to address the part of the refugees. It's surprising that an Israeli would be saying 75 years is a long period of time when the entire state is built on a 2,000-year return. But having said that, Having said that, people, we've achieved something in our struggle, and it wasn't from us being so creative back in the 1948 and 49 and 50s. It was because the international system of governance recognized the huge injustice that was done to us and did create this body called UNRWA and defined our refugees in a way which is slightly different than other refugees. We will utilize that to the nth degree. Nobody can strip us from an achievement that supports our right to come back home. Having said that, we also have rights within the broader UN Refugee Agency as well. That aside, from a practical perspective, research has been done. 70% of the lands that Palestinians left in 1948 are empty today in Israel.
Yes.
Having said that, I do not personally believe that 5 million refugees are going to pick up and come back home. I know a lot of the refugee community in Jordan. They're actually the business leaders in Jordan. They're very well established. I assume many of them will not pick up and relocate to Elid. However, I believe that they will want to be compensated for whatever they lost during the war. It's up to the refugees to decide, and it's up to the international community to give them pathways forward to decide on. I would imagine many of them would like to come back to Palestine, the new state, the truncated state of Palestine. And if only Israel would recognize that and allow us to flourish our economy now, even under occupation, we would be able to create a different reality on the ground to make that more enticing. Not 1 Rawabi, 10 Rawabis, 50 Rawabis. And that would be an option that the refugees would have. However, the Israelis do not allow 1 Rawabi to be properly created. It tortured that project until today. But ultimately, the refugee has a right to decide. And Israel has an ability over time to absorb refugees. We know that. We know that from 1 million Russian refugees. We know that from Ethiopian refugees. And you know what? Instead of us having a theoretical discussion, how about if Israel opened the doors for 100 individual refugees to come back to Israel? And let's use it as a test case. They won't let that happen. Mm-hmm. Let's have a second test. How about having 100 individuals come into the West Bank and give me an opportunity to convince them that the West Bank is worthy to create a future? That won't happen as well as long as Israel's controlling the borders. So Israel has blocked any way that we can take incremental steps forward to try to address this difficult issue, which at the end of the day, as I noted, is an Israeli responsibility par excellence.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam. Dhafer, we
yes,
come again to you.
I don't know if you hear me.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for all. I want to give you some information about 1967.
Can you tell us, please, where you from?
I'm from Ramallah.
أهلين.
Ramallah, West Bank. On 1967, the West Bank was under authority of Jordan government. And when we say to the Israeli that the West Bank is occupied territory, they said that we are not occupied your land because the authority was Jordan authority, not Palestinian authority. So it's not occupation. I have an idea to tell you that if we make a federation with Jordan Kingdom, we can make confederation with Israeli government. That's my opinion. And thanks for Dr. Sam Bahour for his information. He gives me a lot of idea for that.
شكرا ظافر.
You're welcome.
وليد تفضل.
Thank you so much. Sam, I'd like to applaud your response to Avi. God knows I love you so much, Avi. And I want to add to Sam's response, and here I'm leaning on Edward Said's article, The One State Solution, published in 1999 in the New York Times, that the law of return and the right of return either they are both implemented or both discarded, because applying one without the other is just a practice of power. I don't want to say supremacy. Okay, now, Mr. Bernard, thank you. I have a question for you. You started your conversation by saying that it's about the two sides politically initiating the peace process. So how do you think we can force them or have them sit at the same table? I know it's easier said than done. Mr. Sam, I have a couple of questions for you. I mean, you've been leaning your presentation on the international law instead of the US exclusivity in terms of dealing with the peace process. So, and here it might be intertwined with my question for Bernard, is that Israelis and Palestinians began the Madrid and Oslo process without the American intervention. It was done along the way. So how could it possibly be done? The second question is that why is it in your eyes such a bad thing for Palestinian new generation of leadership to abandon that statehood agency? Because the status quo on the ground, as the end of your presentation has pointed out, the status quo on the ground basically were small cantons. And I don't see, as a young Palestinian myself, I don't see any livelihood of a Palestinian state. I mean, that ship has already sailed. And with the current political situation inside of Israel, also, I can't say that it's dim, it's actually dark. And the hope of a second state for Palestinians is not feasible the way I see it. And this is someone talking to you who belongs to a family who that had played its fair part and had its fair share in establishing the PA and establishing that Palestinian agency on the ground. So when someone like me says that the Palestinian Authority is useless and there is no future for a Palestinian state, I mean, I must have hit a hard wall of bricks. So, and again, my last point, I'm sorry, I'm taking too much time, is that you mentioned that the partition plan, the resolution 181, West Jerusalem was not included. However, it was accepted by the international community to be an Israeli sovereign. So what stops the same situation from happening again with East Jerusalem, especially after the Trump declaration of Jerusalem being a unified capital for Israel? And thank you so much, and I'm sorry for taking too much time.
Thank you, Walid. Lot of points, lot of questions. Who want to start? Bernard?
أنا بالعربي بحكي.
فوزي لا بدي يجاوبوه أول ثواني. تفضل برنارد.
Let me see if I can say something a little hopeful. Obviously, the drift in Israel has been to a kind of messianic, theocratic, populist regime. The first step in any peace process is to change that government. I mean, let's be clear. And there are hundreds of thousands of Israelis who are becoming much more aware of what's at stake here. And I think that, before we get to that point, we're not going to make a great deal of progress. But let's assume that a government which is not reflecting those personalities that Sam put up in his slide, let's say we get another government which is more amenable to the appeal of potential peace, to a peace process, international law, etc., and does not look at the West Bank as being a divine promise. In that case, what can we do now to try to jumpstart the idea that the benefits of cooperation are so great that a confederation with Palestine, I'm talking now from the Israeli side, that a confederation with Palestine could have great consequence? Sam and I have mentioned some things in our New York Times article, but I think we can be, even more visionary in some way. If I were Israel, I would be very interested in this high-speed train coming from the Gulf. I mean, the Egyptians aren't so happy about it because it means bypassing the Suez Canal, which they'd have to be compensated for. But this is not just a pipe dream. This is actually in planning stages, that a high-speed train comes from the Emirates up through Jordan and Haifa and uses Haifa as a port for South Asian goods. This is the kind of thing that gets us thinking creatively and realistically about a joint future. There's also the possibility of the Med-Dead Canal, which has been talked about. That you don't have to make peace yet to do it, but you have to have two sides willing to entertain a peace process to do it.
That's nonsense.
Pardon?
That's nonsense.
What is nonsense?
Justice is more important than money.
Okay,
I'm sorry, I muted the person who just interrupted. Please continue.
Okay, there's other possibilities. Maybe this will appeal to you more. I think the most urgent problem right now in Palestine is healthcare. And the idea of Israel and Palestine merging healthcare systems is really not that crazy. The Israeli healthcare system is scalable, and Israeli hospitals are scalable. It's possible for the healthcare system to become a joint healthcare system. Israel's HMOs already have a very large number of not just Arab patients, but Arab doctors and nurses and pharmacists working in it. And if you begin to lay down the prospect of that kind of cooperation in a tangible way, show me, don't tell me, show me, don't tell me. Once you have that, you begin to create a groundwork for this kind of cooperation. I'll say one last thing. It took Sam 15 years to get residency in the West Bank, 15 years to get residency in a Palestinian city, Ramallah. How much better would we be off if the Israeli government, with very little security concern, with very little fear of its security implications, if they let 100, 200, 300 Sam Bahours come in and build businesses the way Sam came during the Oslo process? And just think about the impact of that on goodwill on both sides. What does Israel have to lose? The Messianists have to lose the prospect of simply annexing the territory, integrating it, and cleansing it ethnically. That obviously, but anybody who's concerned about security should applaud the idea of having Palestinian businesses thriving. Why not? Why not allow that to happen?
Yes.
I will just very briefly try to answer some of the questions that were out. Dhafir, regarding Jordan, if Jordan claimed control in 1948 to 1967, that doesn't make it legal from an international law perspective. Having said that, we know that in 1988, as a result of the first Palestinian Intifada, that the Jordanian government officially reneged on any claims that it has on any parts of the occupied territory. So if anyone thought that it may have been illegal, Jordan itself reneged any kind of claim. That's important. And as long as the Palestinian political agency never accepted the Jordanian rule, which they didn't, that's why we have something called the PLO, I think that makes the case of why the Israeli claim that it's Jordanian territory and not ours. Why not Turkish territory? Why not keep going back in history for as long as you want? Walid, I highly appreciate your comments, and let me try to briefly address them. First, the US role did monopolize the Oslo process, and the idea is how we change that. I think we're changing it. Number one, failure doesn't have many supporters, and Israel and the US has failed so many times on this file that they are losing, it's eroding their regional and international support for anything they think about moving forward here. Having noted that, we also see that the US's failure with Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and other places in the region, Yemen, Sudan, that we're seeing new stakeholders enter the equation, whether it's Turkey, whether it's Iran, whether it's Saudi Arabia, and the whammy is a China seeing the opening and using its leverage to bring stakeholders in the region that weren't friends, like Iran and Saudi Arabia, to be able to come together to work together. That is as much it is about Saudi Arabia and Iran as it is about China saying, I'm entering the equation from a regional perspective. So there are new stakeholders that I think will be able to hold the US more accountable, given that the UN system has this veto option, which is never going to allow it to be a body that can actually hold the parties, the 5 permanent members at least, accountable, whether that's the US or Russia. In terms of my worry about a new generation coming forward and dropping statehood, I'm not worried at all. As I noted in my introduction, I'm accepting, in my political thinking, I'm accepting the failure, in my opinion, of a Palestinian political agency over time on many different fronts, where we reached a point where that Palestinian political agency, and I'm speaking before it fragmented more recently, Hamas Fatah, I'm speaking before that, a Palestinian political agency that came forward, recognized the state of Israel, and called for statehood as the definition of our self-determination. So I respect that and I support that. And that brings me to the Confederation model to make that happen. Again, the Confederation is the vehicle that a two-state solution can come forward with. However, my political being also has an internal part to it. And that's the internal debate within the Palestinian political agency. And there, I may have a very different opinion. I may be one of the strong supporters to drop statehood and call for civil rights. That's a discussion that we have to have in our political agency, which is defunct today. And that's why we're putting a lot of time trying to get it back to becoming an operating body. And whatever the majority of the Palestinians agree to, I will respect. That doesn't mean I agree with them, but I will respect. Equally that I'm, as an American, respected the Trump presidency, even though there's not an iota that I would probably agree with him on, but I respect the agency, because in politics, that's what matters. And that's very possible, and that's why I put to date under in red and underlined, because the new generation is actively looking how to formally, i.e. through the political agency, drop statehood. I tell my children who tell me that, I understand where you're coming from, but I don't want to jump out of the frying pan of occupation into the fire of full-scale apartheid, because that's what calling for civil rights will mean for a very, very long time. I think Confederation is a better way to move forward, because if it works, we can build a future that today it's going to be very hard to envision, which is a very constructive future. If it doesn't work, the two states will have to deal with themselves as border states, like any other two states, Russia, Ukraine, have to find out how to deal with themselves. Lastly, again, I just want to reemphasize what I said in my last slide. For me, Confederation is calling an Israeli bluff. I'm not convinced that any Israeli government, today's or for the last 70 years, is interested or desirous of a Palestinian state to emerge between the river and the sea. But I need a language to be able to talk to allies and to the international community if I want to convince them. And I'm focused on my political agency's formal decision of two states, trying to create a vehicle to make it happen. And now the international community that has weight in this equation has to come forward and view who's blocking the ability for this conflict to be retracked to something much more positive. It's clearly Israel. And lastly, what stops the international community from accepting East Jerusalem like they did West Jerusalem? Absolutely nothing. If the international system of accountability is not working, What is stopping them is us, our steadfastness, the Israelis who are standing with us, the solidarity movement in the world, the church movement in the world, the human rights organizations in the world are the only thing between us and the Ben Gvirs and Smotrich moving forward with actual annexation on the ground without announcing it. It's happening. They just announced 4,000 units 2 days ago. The annexation is happening on the ground. Thus, there's an urgency for us to be able to find a model that can, and I don't call it solution, to be honest with you, and definitely I don't call it final solution. That word final solution was used in history for some reasons that we all know about. There's no final solution in history. There's a track that you get on and you try. And if it works out, you're in a better place. If it doesn't work out, you try something else. But to think that there's some kind of button that's going to find a solution and everybody goes home happy is not going to happen. Not in our region, not in Russia, and not in Ukraine. So for me, the issue is for us to engage ourselves, and these kinds of webinars are part of that, to bring an urgency to the discussion for the international community to act and to bypass this the US hegemony of blocking any kind of accountability on Israel. So Confederation is a framework and it's a language. We can adopt it to be able to see the future in a different way. If we don't adopt that, we have to adopt something else, because remember my assumption, neither parties are going anywhere. So we have to find what works as soon as possible in order to have an experience which is on the ground.
Thank you, Sam. Zoom users, are you Korean, or can you please say your name? Yes, you, the lady with the raised hand.
Zoom user, you're muted.
Zoom
You're
user.
muted, Zoom
It's
user.
called Zoom
You need to
user now.
unmute.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So let's move on. Joseph.
Thank you, Warda. First of all, I want to say thank you very much to Sam Bahour for your excellent presentation. I'm from Ireland and I chair an interfaith group for Palestine, which is moderate Jews and Gentiles, working to end the Nakba genocide of the Palestinians by Jews from the Jewish state, a genocide supported by Jews worldwide and the longest and best documented genocide in history. So we rarely hear an articulate, well-presented Palestinian voice. And it's just a pleasure, and I want to thank Warda and Maury for allowing you the platform, because very few Palestinians get such an excellent platform. The second thing I want to say is that the language, and this is a question both for Sam and Bernard, but mostly for Sam, the word we're using in Ireland is genocide. The Nakba genocide of the Palestinians. We don't talk about conflict. And I'm just wondering, is there a fear about using this word, which correctly describes what's happening to the Palestinians? Or should we use a different word instead? The third thing I would say, I'm from Ireland. Ireland, we have a two-state solution. We've had it since 1922. It's worked out very well for the oppressed minority, the Catholics, and Protestants have stayed in the independent Republic of Ireland, but many of them have left because they lost their privileged position and they left peacefully, and our first president was a Protestant. I live in Ulster in Northern Ireland. Broadly speaking, Catholics are very like the Palestinians. It was a sectarian Protestant state, and the Protestants very much associate with the Israelis. We're moving forward thanks to the intervention, the positive intervention of the United States, because of the widespread Irish diaspora in the United States who had votes. And I think that's a model, the Irish two-state model, which is moving towards a one-state model where Catholics can have their equal rights. Is that a model we should be looking to? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joseph. Sam, would you like to comment, or Avishai? Bernard?
Sure. Thank you for your comments. Genocide, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, occupation. I assume a little bit of all of it applies today. And that's why we're not only throwing out words for able to find the right word, because there's not probably one right word that encompasses the human tragedy that happened to us. However, after we became a non-member observer state in the UN, we got the ability, the tool, to be able to go to the two places in the international system of governance that actually defines what those mean in reality and hold people accountable. It's the International Criminal Court for individuals and the International Court of Justice for states. We've brought cases to both of those. And for example, in the International Criminal Court, we've been struggling for 7 years to open a single case. In the Ukraine-Russia issue, the US behind Ukraine, they have opened, I think, 2,500 cases and opened an office in Ukraine to be able to follow those cases up. So again, it's the political will of the states that are monopolizing the global system of governance. I would focus on military occupation because I think no matter what else you call it, that has been not only defined in international law, but accepted by every state in the world except the occupier as being the state of affairs here. If it is not, I tell my Israeli friends, a military occupation, tell me what it is. Because if it's not occupation, it means that I in Ramallah am a subject of the Israeli government between the river to the sea, but there's two bodies of law that apply. Well, that's called apartheid. And again, these are not words that we throw out. These are words that are defined in international law. And I will leave it to the lawyers at the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice to say if it applies or not. But ultimately, the military occupation, which is the framework that I live under, has to end. And in order for it to end, we need a vision how to get out of it. And if we put Confederation in front of us, there are issues. Confederation may take 10 years to work out. But if we're heading in that direction, there are actions that need to take place today that serve that end game. Economically, there's many. If the economic boot of occupation comes off of our neck today, we would be able to create a different reality on the ground to make people see the future in a different way. We don't have that today. We are being suffocated to the point where people are seeing many that the only way out of this is to pick up arms and to go back to armed struggle, which I think is a losing struggle. But again, military occupation is what we can all agree upon. The other words, I'll leave it to the professionals to actually define the particularities of it.
Thank you, Sam. Very good answer, and I appreciate, how you look at the whole picture from a rational point of view. Okay, Gidon.
Okay.
Before
yeah, okay, Bernard. Sorry,
I just feel I have to say, as someone who's been speaking about the importance of Palestinian rights for 50 years, I must tell you, when you look back on the tragedy of this conflict, one of the things that has contributed so greatly to the tragedy is hyperbole. And I dissociate myself utterly from the idea that what Israel has perpetrated on Palestine is genocide. I find it offensive. There's sometimes you get to a point where hyperbole becomes a kind of self-inflicted rage, and the rage becomes a rationale for atrocity, and I simply reject it. And I'll stop there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Gidon, again.
Okay, so I want to start with a comment to Avi about the Palestinians returning to their places, and somehow I just understand the village mentality. The village mentality, certainly when they left, when they were forced to leave, is very different than appears in the cities. I was like in my more right-wing days, when I was active in Moked Sheli, and I lived on kibbutz. I had a friend from Jdeide that lived in Akko because he worked in the education and it was easier for him. And he would say, I feel like I'm in exile. I have to go every day. I just in exile. That's the way he felt. You can't tell people about how they have to feel. Yeah. Does those feelings change in time? They do. Yeah. You'll notice that most of the Jews are not really interested in coming here. Yeah. For instance, now we'll go here to the situation here. Yeah, I'm for any solution, but I see one major problem and I don't know how to address it. And the real problem isn't the solution. 2 states, 1 state, confederation, federation, whatever, it isn't. We need to figure out a new narrative, yeah, a communal effort for Palestinians and Israelis, a new narrative, and talk it up every place we go. I remember when I left kibbutz and I came to Jerusalem, and I remember seeing all the colonial types working really hard to change the narrative. I can't say colonialist anymore, but I can continue doing it. They are not settlers, they are colonialists. We have to work on that. That is the major thing. After that, however we knit this sweater, it'll work. When we can develop a communal narrative. Thank you.
I just want to say, I remember the first time I saw in Haaretz the term Judea and Samaria outside of scare quotes. And it's in 1974, I think, when Gush Emunim was really getting started. And I remember thinking at the time, my God, people are not just changing the narrative, but living in a delusional reality that is going to be very dangerous. And it may take 50 years for us to change the narrative, but you have to start somewhere. They understood it. We have to understand it.
I would say as well that I don't believe that there is a single narrative that can be crafted. Remember, I come from the US, so we have 2 narratives there too. One is Thanksgiving Day and Pilgrims, and another is the Native Americans. I think we can come to terms that there are 2 narratives that are in parallel in a way, but the Confederation model gives us something that we can work with because it allows us to have our own state, our own education system. We can teach our narrative, but we can also do it not only within a state capacity, but within a confederal and communal capacity. So there'll be a joint narrative moving forward. We're not going to find a joint narrative to explain the past, but we can craft one together on how the future will look. And that's where I see a narrative playing a role. But the next day is the next day for us. It's not going to go away anytime soon. The next day is the next day. The 1967 occupation happened in history. And we should be able to teach our children that. But to teach them that in a abstract is very difficult because we're not giving them any way forward. A confederal model allows us to teach our history, to teach our narrative, and to teach our communal joint future together.
Amen. Amen. You know, the license plate in Quebec says, Je me souviens. I'm from Montreal originally. Je me souviens. What are they remembering? The conquest of Quebec by English forces in 1759. You can have a long memory and remember things, but that doesn't mean you're at war forever. That's the way it works.
I agree. And I would just add that requires a historic correction. Refugees have to come home if they want to come home. They all have to be compensated because that will remove that sore spot from history because that happened in history. And I think that can be done. Again, if it's done smartly, we start by building a proper Palestine. And that will attract a lot of Palestinians. And whoever wants to go home can go home. Whoever wants to stay in the States will stay in the States, etc.
Fauzi, you want to go next, Fauzi?
مساء الخير. انا بحكي بالعربي. انا
اهلين شرفني.
الآن أنا اللي فهمته إنه الحديث بدور عن فكرة الحلول، فكرة حل الدولتين. أنا بقول إنه فكرة الحديث عن حل الدولتين هو يعني من باب الطرف الفكري أكثر منه واقعي، لأنه عمليا إسرائيل لم تبقي أي مجال لحل دولتين، لأن الضفة الغربية كل المدن محاطة بالمستوطنات، إحاطة السوار بالمعصم، وباقي الأراضي الفارغة إسرائيل واضع الإيد عليها تماما، وبالتالي أنت بتحكي عن تجمعات سكانية فلسطينية محاصرة حصار مطلق، إلا إذا كان بدهم يعتبرونا دول زي الفاتيكان، يسوونا مجموعة دول في كل مدينة دولي، وسووا اتحاد كونفدرالي للدويلات الفلسطينية لاتحاد المدن الفلسطينية. يعني يستحيل إقامة دولة واحدة، بالإضافة لأن عندنا مشكلة في النظام التربوي لدى الجمهورين الفلسطيني والإسرائيلي، إنه الجهتين ما عندهم نظام تربوي وتعليمي بحض على السلام، التعايش، فكرة الحلول هذه غير موجودة، وبالتالي كل الحلول بالإطار السياسي تبدأ في إطار الطرف الفكري أكثر منه يعني شيء واقعي وممكن. شكرا. يعني بديش أطيل لأنه أنا بالعربي بحكي، أحتاج لترجمة.
I will translate shortly what Fawzi said. Fawzi said that Confederation is theoretically a program, but it's not fact. How to say that that Israel didn't give the opportunity to make it reasonable because of what the settlements spread on all the West Bank, and maybe it will be like Vatican. Every place, every Palestinian city will be like Vatican, and so he thinks that the Confederation, it's only a theoretical solution.
Shukran, Fawzi. I would just note, should I answer in English or Arabic?
Try in English and I will translate for him.
Thank you for your comment. I agree, and I actually said in my presentation that we are not expecting today for this to become a practical tool in today's ecosystem. However, what we've presented is fikr, and is theory in terms of envisioning a way out. I would disagree with you that two states is not possible. And why would I say that today? And I say today, I don't know what I'll say tomorrow because things are changing on the ground. But if Israel already made a two-state solution impossible, we would not see the huge aggression that we're seeing today by this right-wing Israeli government. The Ben Gvirs and the Smotrich are aggressively trying to create an inability for two states to be created. And that is defined by some very specific projects, such as E1, building an E1, a settlement block to divide the West Bank. And it's also by bringing in another 1 million settlers into the occupied territory. They know that they are at a point where two states is very feasible today. If Israel is held accountable, the wrongs can be reversed, especially since this Palestinian political agency has been very generous and offered the concept of land swaps to be able to bring in the 3 settlement blocks to be part of Israel, and we receive land elsewhere. So they know that there's a model on the table that could work if the international community pressured in that direction. So what are they doing? They're aggressively trying to bring more settlers and aggressively trying to create the E1 project to divide the West Bank. So I think we still have a little bit of breathing room to be able to act, but there is an urgency, because if they are successful, and with impunity they could be successful, if you come to me in a year from now, I may tell you I've changed my opinion. The reality on the ground is too difficult to untangle. I'm not there yet. I saw how the Israeli settlers left Gaza. 3 weeks before they left, the Prime Minister of Israel, Ariel Sharon, said that the settlement of Netzarim is more important than Tel Aviv. 3 weeks later, they were out. And Sinai, the same thing. Where there's political will, acts can happen to be able to find a way forward. If there's no political will and no accountability, we're on a very slippery slope. And I'll be the first to tell you that when we hit the bottom of the slope, I give up on statehood and I call for civil rights. And I want a house right next to Bernie's to live in.
شكرا. فوزي فهمت عليه ولا ترجم لك؟ انت ميوتد.
احكي لي الخلاصة
الخلاصة
صغيرة.
بقول انه هو معك، انه هي من ناحية انه ممكن نظرية بسبب ايش اللي عم بيصير، بس هي يعني باختصار بقول لك انه كيف صار بغزة وخلال 3 أسابيع من تصريح اللي قال انه نتسريم اهم من تل ابيب، وبرضه تركوا نتسريم. فهو بتوقع انه اذا فعلا في اراده انه يكون في سلام ويكون في اتفاق، ممكن انه يتركوا المستوطنات. طبعا
فوزي في نقطة أساسية، إن لو الحكومة الحالية شاعرة إن هي سكرت بوابة التو ستيتس الدولتين، كان ما بنشوف اللي بنشوفه اليوم، دعوة لمليون يهودي زيادة في المستوطنات بخلال سنوات قليلة، ودعوة لبناء E1 في القدس. هذا خطوات بتبين إن الطرف الثاني فاهمة إن دولتين لسه ممكنة إذا بنجحوا. أنا معك، بتروح الاحتمال.
أوكي شكرا.
يعني أنا اللي بدي أقوله إنه لو كان رئيس وزراء إسرائيل أحمد الطيبي أو موري اللي معانا لا يمكن يكون هناك حل لدولتين، لأنه بالمنطق النظري ممكن، لكن قلت لك عمليا مستحيل يعني. وانت طبعا اكيد يعني بتعرف واقع الضفه الغربيه تماما، مش محتاج اقول لك اياه انت وحتى الاسرائيليين اللي معنا. جزء الامريكان ما بيعرفوش، يعني لما بيحكوا عن دولتين انت بتحكي عن مساحه الضفه الغربيه، وكل فلسطين بحالها كلها قد مدينه في دوله ثانيه، بالتالي يعني الحلول كثير معقده.
نعم.
يعني بضل
شكرا فوزي.
أنا على فكرة أنا مؤمن بحل الدولة الواحدة أكثر منه دولتين بصراحة يعني.
شكرا فوزي. Fauzi said even if Ahmad Tibi and Mori were the prime minister of Israel, they won't be able to make a solution. Peaceful solution. شوي pessimist, but maybe miracles can be also be. We are here to believe in miracles.
Warda could make the solution. I think the solution, if reasonable people were there, including myself, including Warda, including you, Fauzi, we could find a solution very easily. That's I'm sure. I want to first thank you again, Sam and Bernard, very interesting. I want to ask you 3 quick questions, and I know other people are raising their hands. First, we are in a week of conferences and talks about the a land for all plan, and which is also a Confederation idea. I wanted to hear from you if there's any differences between your vision and the land for all vision. That's first question. Second one is, I know you said it's more a theoretical discussion, but we here would like to get some hope that it's more than theoretical. So I wanted to hear from you what your thoughts are about how things can change, whether it should be bottom up, top down, international intervenence, or any other ideas that you might have. That's the second question. And third one, Bernard, you mentioned that with the Confederation solution, basically we are not going to have the risk of having the security issues that we had during the Oslo process. And I was interested to understand why you say so, and if you can explain that. So, yeah, thank you.
Let me start with the last issue first. The problem during Oslo was that there was an effort at joint patrols originally of Area B. There was an effort to create some kind of joint responsibility for security. And you could say, in a way that's rather sad and corrupted, that there is security cooperation even today between the Palestinian Authority and Israel. That, you know, that has degenerated tremendously into Israel controlling a system of collaborators and so on. We know all that. Anyone who even watches Fauda knows all that by now. So I don't want to romanticize the idea of security cooperation. It can be corrupted too. However, there will never be peace between the two sides without a great deal of security cooperation, eventually between two sovereign entities, because on both sides, even though Ben-Gvir, God willing, will be thrown out of power, and if we continue using phrases like God willing, maybe he'll never be thrown out of power, but let's say, God willing, Ben-Gvir is thrown out of power. He's not going anywhere either. And you can look at both sides having people who are committed to a fight to the finish, who will not simply give up on a dream of appropriating the whole, who see themselves as standing fast against sworn enemies and will commit atrocities. They're going to commit acts of terror. Even if only 1% of such people will commit acts of terror, so we're still talking about thousands of people. So we know that there are going to be groups on both sides who are going to be committed to acts that will be thought disgusting and atrocities by the other side. You have to have some kind of security environment where the two states commit to a joint security environment so that any atrocity from either side is thought to be an attack on the system itself and not an attack by one nation against the other. It's got to be thought a crime of terror against the system that the majorities on both sides have committed to. That is inescapable. Inescapable. There will never be peace without envisioning some kind of joint security environment. Now, I want to talk about Land for All just for a second. I'm going to have to go in like 4 minutes, but I just want to say, my understanding, I've been very involved with the people who've done Land for All. I have a pretty strong sense that they're all migrating now to this very program. They're migrating to a conception of Confederation, which is very much like the one Sam and I have proposed. But they didn't start that way. And part of the reason why I have a slightly queasy feeling about what Land for All started out as is that, in a way, they took for granted something I don't think people with democratic imagination can simply take for granted, which is that, you know, Jews want everything, Palestinians want everything, both sides see the whole land as their natural right, and that you have to find a way to create some kind of joint environment in which each side claims everything. I don't think that's really the way Democrats think. When Sam was talking before about saying, you know, we're not going to agree on our narratives, we have to find a way to, we have to think about the future and not about the past. I think you also have to recognize that in this little place, this little Los Angeles place, you have about close to 9 million Jews. Maybe, no, excuse me, it's more like 7.5 million Jews. You have something like 6.5 to 7 million Palestinians. They live in separate worlds in a way. And the only way you can figure out what territory each world gets is to say, look, at some level, even if it's a dotted line border, you have to figure that the political border gets drawn around the cultural one. That's the way Democrats think. Government derives from the just consent of the governed. People will create borders that have to do with their natural attachment to their language, to their culture, and to all of what that entails. I think Land for All had this rather romantic idea. No, the maximal ideas of one side and the maximal ideas of the other side somehow are both right. No, they're not both right. They're not. You can't be a Democrat and say that I'm a Jew, therefore I look at the West Bank and see Judea and Samaria. Or I'm a Jew and therefore I look at the wall of Suleiman the Magnificent and the wall of Suleiman the Magnificent and say, if Herod were alive, he might have built something like that, so it's mine. And I have to say about this, the Palestinians as well. Frankly, if I talk to a Palestinian who says, I came from Haifa is mine, I'm not saying Palestinians should have to go to Aqaba in order to go to the sea. I'm not saying that. But you look at Haifa, you look at Tel Aviv today, if what you're seeing when you see Tel Aviv are all the plantations that were expropriated in 1949, I'm sorry, you're not going to be a partner for me. Because you can't, if you're looking at the Israeli towers and everything that was invested in the creation of that very cool city on the Mediterranean, and all you see is that that Palestinians were disinherited and they have to come back, and the hell that the Israeli tower is there. We're going to just be there. I think you're living in the same delusion as the Jew who looks at the walls of Jerusalem and sees a Jewish city.
Because of that, we say that we will not look at the past, but we will look to the future. And if we can learn from the past and try to correct as much as we could from what happened in the past, it will be better for us to heal from the past, mistakes.
Absolutely.
If I may address the part of the question, I agree with Bernie on how my vision of Homeland for All was the same as well. We've met with them several times. We've been in discussions. But I want to answer the other part of the question about the how. How do we see change happening? I would promote 4 specific items. Number 1, from a political perspective, recognize the state of Palestine. States who have not recognized the state of Palestine in 2023 have missed the bus, because 138, 140, I think today, countries have already recognized the state. If any state is saying that they support a 2-state solution, but has recognized the state of Israel and cannot bring themselves to recognize the state of Palestine, we don't believe them anymore, starting with the US. So from a political perspective, that should be our political call. We need, number 2, hold the parties accountable. Don't hold one party accountable, hold the parties accountable. In international law, there's a principle of proportionality. You hold the parties in proportion to their violations of international law, in violations of their crimes against humanity. So we need to be able to allow the mechanisms of international governance to hold the parties accountable. Thirdly, we have to resist. We have to resist. It's human nature to resist a military occupation. I would say that we need to non-violently resist. And that is a judgment based on historical experience. We are not going to win in a military battle with the 3rd strongest army in the world, a nuclear power, armed to the teeth, supported by the West like no other. That is not a battle that we can win. However, hard power is not the only kind of power available to resistance movements. Soft power sometimes is more effective. So I would say boycott, divestment, sanction, not necessarily all 3 together as the movement, although that can be an option, but those 3 concepts, which Ireland was very thankfully brought the boycott forward as a concept itself, can each be used. If you don't like those, there's 101 other ways to non-violently resist this occupation. I would highly recommend, in terms of resisting, for people to screen, maybe you can do it on one of these calls, the new film that came out called Boycott by Just Vision. It talks about how 30 states, state legislations in the US have passed legislation to penalize any American citizen that uses boycott as an act of protest. It's a shocking film. It's actually streaming. You can find it on your streaming platforms. So recognize Palestine politically, accountability, resistance, and the fourth one is a key one. Be in solidarity with the Palestinians. There are 5 million people that wake up under occupation every single day. They have to go to work, they have to feed their children, they have to get an education. There are another 5 million people in the refugee world that wake up every day. Be in solidarity with Palestinians, because this is a prolonged conflict, and we cannot romanticize the Palestinian struggle. We need to understand that there are real needs for the Palestinians, and being in solidarity doesn't only mean financial support. It means moral support, it means connecting with organizations here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the 4 paths that I would use to find us to be a player in moving forward, and not just an observer hoping it moves forward by itself.
So I just want to say thank you. I'm afraid I have to go. I'll endorse in advance anything Sam tells you between now and 2 o'clock. Sam, God bless. I'll see you soon, and thank you all.
Thank you, Bernard, for being here.
Thanks, Professor AVISHAI.
It was a very good point that you brought about financial partnership that will make really a good peace when, or will encourage the peace when we think about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for coming. Okay, so let's go to Mark.
Yeah, I guess Professor AVISHAI has left, so Sam, I guess you have the hot seat here. But you know, my take on this is, and is that I come from this perspective, seeing large obstacles to peace that exist on both sides of this conflict. I would like to see the Palestinian side condemn the incitement and the violence that exists from Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, the Iran regime, the calls to, be against the world's only Jewish state. Also recognize that Palestinian leadership rejected peace in 1947, 2000, and 2008. I say all of that because there are large obstacles to peace that exist on both sides. And I think that a joint narrative needs to emerge. I mean, I don't understand how you've got this tiny sliver of land, right? That's the size of Los Angeles or New Jersey or whatever the size of this land is. It's very small. And if both sides want to live in peace, they have to work together and they have to find a way. I mean, both Jews and Palestinians have suffered great tragedies, Jews with the Holocaust, Palestinians with the Nakba and the occupation and the settlements. So I think, in my sense, there has to be responsibility on both sides. There has to be good leadership on both sides that has to say, we'll do everything we can to make this work. And I mean, there has to be hard work rolling. I mean, so, and I see your points about international law and resistance, but, we talk about resistance. I mean, Hamas, that can come under the label of resistance. So I think there needs, and you talked about recognition of the state of Palestine. I think that's an important point that both sides need to recognize and respect one another. There should be recognition of the state of Palestine, and there should be recognition of the state of Israel. I disagree with the right of return. I think a right of return for tens of millions of Palestinians would end the state of Israel. So anyway, those are some of my thoughts. And then I guess I would like to hear your perspective on potentially some of those questions.
Sure, briefly. I mean, each one requires a talk of its own. I put 2 articles that I've written in the past in the chat. I would disagree with you that the Palestinians turned down a peace offer that was made to them. And I say that not only myself, the advisors that were with Clinton during the Camp David Accords, and the foreign minister of Israel, who was in the Accords as well, in the Camp David sessions as well, have both documented, and it's been written about very extensively. They both acknowledged there was nothing on the table to sign. Yes, there was negotiations, but these negotiations were between the Israelis amongst themselves, thinking they were giving a most generous offer. But the generous offer had nothing to do with what the Palestinians require as a bare minimum. So I think that has kind of been factually stated, that there wasn't something to sign, and it failed. If I come to negotiate to buy your house, I cannot negotiate for 2 days with you, and then it drops, it fails. I cannot come back to you 10 years later and say, but you told me it's only $100,000, when today it's worth $500,000, right? So when negotiations fail, they fail, and all the discussions that went with them fail as well. What the international community, the US specifically, is trying to do today is to say, let's pick up where we left off. You Palestinians said back 30 years ago that you would accept this. And they expect today's leadership, after all the damage that has been done, to pick off on that point. That's a very flawed way. I mean, I have an MBA degree from Tel Aviv University. My negotiations teacher would laugh that out of the house as being a model for negotiations. In terms of incitement, that's a trick word today. What's incitement? Is it the Israeli definition of incitement? Because if it is, what I'm telling you today is incitement, and I can be arrested tonight. Actually, there's 1,100 Palestinians today in administrative detention. No charges, no trial. They're picked up at night, about 10 to 20 every single night, and put in jail for a month to 6 months, renewable indefinitely, because they have incited. I don't know what that means anymore. If we're talking about other states which are making statements that Israel doesn't like, it is not our responsibility what other states say. Iran is its own state. It has its own opinion. It can say what it wants. If I, as a struggling people, want to turn on the TV every day and do a survey of what everybody has said about this issue and condemn this or support that, I will not have time for my struggle. I care about my political agency and what my political agency has said. My political agency has been very clear. They recognize the state of Israel. Israel has not recognized the state of Palestine. They have called for the last 2 decades for nonviolent popular resistance, not armed struggle. Are there acts of armed struggle? Yes, of course. Are there in Israel acts of hilltop youth burning people in their homes? Yes, but that doesn't represent the Israeli political agency. It doesn't really matter, with all due respect, what you think or what I think. It is what our political agencies do. And then what we think must be influenced within our political agency for them to do the same or change. And that's where the trick is. Because if you want to find a Palestinian that said something wrong, I'll find it before you. If I want to find an Israeli Jew who said something wrong or did something wrong, you'll find it before I can find it. The issue is not to find the cases to make our point right. The issue is, do we have a framework that is beyond the individual cases? Mine is international law, only because I'm convinced there's 2 bodies of law. There's the law of the jungle and there's international law. If I drop international law, the only thing I have left is the law of the jungle. And there, I wouldn't be talking to you. I would be trying to learn how to get a nuclear bomb, how to get longer missiles, better accuracy in my missiles. I refuse to go there. I believe that nonviolent resistance with a political agency that is very, very clear and has recognized the other side, that is so key. So again, I don't feel responsibility for any other country in the world. I feel responsibility for my political agency. And again, I don't think we missed opportunities. And one of those articles that I put in the chat will give you my take on that. But I'd be more than willing to have a conversation with you in depth, because that's really something I think about a lot.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Frederick?
Hello, thank you for making time for me. I wanted to first say, Sam, that you have the best delivery of the message that I've ever heard from the Palestinian side. You know, I'm really grateful to this group to put us in touch with speakers like you, not just thinkers. And I hope that your message can come forward more, because we need to hear it. And you know, it's a smart message, it's an articulate message. And my participation in the group here has been sort of a person of peace mediation, conflict management, without taking any side from one or the other. And I'm very glad to have heard the presentation that you and Bernard gave. And I wanted to address one issue that Bernard mentioned initially, when he mentioned that there were models for what you guys are trying to do from Belgium and Canada. And I happen to be from Belgium. So
it's not the best example.
It is a perfect example, and at the same time, there's some small differences that are important to note, right? You brought up the idea of a confederation being sort of a marriage with two individuals coming together and have to be able to get back to their own self if things don't work out. But in the interest of success, and success within the next 20 years, you know, while we're still alive, I wonder if you would be prepared to accept the idea of changing this to a civil rights movement cause for the benefits of a resolution a little faster. And in that respect, you know, the Belgian model is interesting because Belgium initially was a unified country, and then it federalized between the two sides. And so I wonder if it wouldn't be a smart way to go to say, okay, let's focus on equality and democracy rather than deciding, you know, what territory is it? And I've had this discussion with people in this group who are settlers, for instance, say, can you recognize Israel? And then they start discussing, well, but which boundary do you want me to recognize? And then it goes to infinity. But if I say, okay, look, the Palestinians who live in area A and B need to be able to vote, right? So if you want to say that Judea and Samaria are part of Israel, then you must allow them to vote. One person, one vote. And then once you have a democratic equal system, then later on you could federalize the way Belgium has done, for instance. What do you think of this approach?
Thank you first for your vote of confidence. Being articulate doesn't mean I'm right. It means that I'm willing to engage. I should note that. I have personally no problem with a one-state solution for a state for all of its citizens. Theoretically, I come from the States. That makes sense to me. However, in the context that we're living in, and in the weak position that the Palestinians are in, and the historic gains that we have gotten from allies around the world, including the international system of governance, I don't throw that out of the window and start over again. And when I see where Israel's moving, right-wing, more fascist-oriented, they're talking about wiping cities and villages off the map. That's not something which is conducive to a state for all of its citizens. If I felt that Israel was ready to accept that, that's where I would go for sure. Having said that, I believe that quicker, because you said for a faster way to get moving forward, I believe the faster way to move forward is to build on all of the allies and international law decisions, like 750 UN resolutions, which have defined two states as a model that they would accept. Because at the end of the day, we don't live in an island. We live amongst other countries and other powers, and we're not an economic power or a military power. So we have to lean on those allies that we have created over the last 40 years. Once we have a confederal model, I actually think the story of the century will be, how did those Palestinians be in conflict for so long? They're working so well together. That will require the removal of military occupation and both states to start to rehabilitate. We have to rehabilitate from the damage that has been done to us, and Israel's going to have to rehabilitate from its colonial environment and detach that from its internal politics to give Israeli citizens to be equal, because that's not even there today. Forget about West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. We're talking about Israeli citizens who are non-Jews are legislatively discriminated against in 65 separate laws. So you're telling me forget that and join them, and Israel will change its mind. So I do think Confederal will get us to that point, but it'll get us there together. And that's the important change.
Yeah. Thank you,
you.
Sam. Yeah. Eunice, you have أهلا Eunice. Sorry إنه we already finished our time, but I'll give you 1 minute, 2 minutes to express what you want to ask, Eunice, and Eli the same. And this will be the last comments.
Okay, thank you, Warda. I'll try to be very, very quick. Firstly, thank you so much, Warda and Maury, for bringing Sam Bahour and Bernard AVISHAI tonight. Sam, I want to tell you, as a Palestinian citizen of Ramallah, I appreciate your activism and your perspective that brings us some hope in our dystopian world in the West Bank. I would like to comment very quickly on Fawzi, who's, by the way, a dear friend and a munadil, say, in my opinion. His concern about the perception of confederation amongst Palestinians in the Arabic language, which should be addressed. Promoting confederation, his concern comes from a specific quibble between Hamas and Fatah several years ago, when Hamas suggested a federation between Gaza and the West Bank, so they would legalize the rule of Gaza. And Fatah called them out on it back then, and many people wrote about it and discussed it. So it had like a negative connotation from at the time. So this like little piece of history is important for us to kind of be aware of. And so it must be made clear that a confederation proposal is with Israel, not between Fatah and Hamas in any kind of promotion or discussion. So secondly, I just want to say, I agree with you, Sam, that little hope that current Israeli leaders would endorse a confederation or any sovereignty for Palestinians or for Palestine. On the other hand, we've observed approval amongst Palestinians in different manners. In different ways. My goal is to promote confederation as an enhancement over the Oslo Accords rather than an alternative to the two-state solution, as a way to kind of like make it more agreeable and be able to even discuss it in both between the both communities. Lastly, I'm excited that we were able to have this session today. And I'm a member of a group that encompasses Palestinians and Israelis who advocate for federation or confederation. We call ourselves the Federal Forum. We would be extremely happy and honored for you to join us and have a conversation with you sometime. Thank you so much. Thank you, Warda, again.
Shukran, Yunus. Eli Cortez? Okay. Thank you, Professor Sam. It was very comprehensive and very, how to say that, thoughtful, inspiring also. You know, I came also from Confederation. I have also my idea, and then I joined Eretz Likulam, or Lands for All. But I have still different points in some points. Maybe I can tell you later about them, which will make I go more about to practical points, and maybe we can also discuss together. So thank you very much for your effort to come and tell us about all what you think, and really I learned a lot. And Mark, thank you again. Even if you don't, agree for all the points that Sam brought, but thank you again for listening and for coming. And I invite you to listen to Palestinian, and even not to Palestinian, to the good Israeli who listen to Palestinian, who are living with them, with the what they suffer. You know, we have a lot of Israeli activists who now see what how Palestinians suffer every day, and what Sam tell you about, you can't make the balance between the suppressor and the suppressed, because there is different different, seas between them. So we hope, we are here to continue hoping, and we have like Mori, like Avi, like a lot of people here who work to get peace. And I can tell you also, we have a party called Kol Izrahiha, or all citizen, that Mori and I think Avi are working to make a change in, we hope to make a change in the political society in Israel. And maybe it will bring, Sam's vision to the to the reality. Thank you again.
Thank you. And I want to just add one more word. Again, thank you, Mark, for organizing this event. I would like to encourage other members of the group